The music cut off in the middle of a piano note. 1 second, soft jazz drifted through our dining room, warm and forgettable. The next, the speaker crackled with a sharp burst of static that made me flinch, my serving spoon hovering over a bowl of roasted vegetables. Then I heard my husband's voice. Clear, close, confident. "Caroline, you deserve honesty." I didn't breathe. His voice wasn't coming from across the table. Thomas was upstairs in his study. The speaker on the sideboard blinked once, then continued playing what it must have pulled from his synced account. "I haven't been happy for years," he said smoothly, like he was presenting quarterly numbers. "We'll handle the divorce with dignity. The assets are already structured. It's cleaner this way." The word divorce landed in my chest like something physical. I stood there, spoon in hand, watching steam curl up from the food while my husband calmly rehearsed leaving me. "She won't see this coming," he added lightly. And I heard it, the small chuckle under his breath. My fingers tightened around the spoon. Oil from the pan hissed too long on the burner. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. "We'll move the lake house before the end of the quarter," he continued. "Once everything's transitioned, it'll be easier for both of us." Transitioned. Like we were replacing carpet, not ending 32 years of marriage. The speaker crackled again. Then the jazz snapped back as if nothing had happened. I wasn't supposed to hear that. So what else had he already arranged? I turned off the stove before the vegetables burned and carried the dishes to the table with steady hands I did not feel. Upstairs, I heard his footsteps cross the hardwood floor. A door closed. A chair shifted. He had no idea the house had betrayed him. I set the plates down carefully. I adjusted the napkins. I smoothed the tablecloth as if this were any other Sunday night. When he finally came downstairs, he looked relaxed, freshly showered, confident. He leaned down and kissed my cheek. "You okay?" he asked. The speaker acted up again. My heart skipped. But my face didn't. "Just static," I said lightly. "Probably the Wi-Fi." He smiled, poured himself water, and began talking about a new commercial property listing like the word divorce had not just echoed through our dining room. I watched him while he ate. The calm rhythm of his chewing, the ease in his posture. There was no guilt in his eyes, only preparation. That was the word that kept circling in my head. Not anger, not impulse. Preparation. After dinner, he carried his plate to the sink and told me he had a few emails to finish. He disappeared into his study, closing the door gently behind him. I didn't follow. I rinsed dishes slowly, listening to the hum of the dishwasher starting up. The house felt different now. Not broken. Exposed. When I was sure he was settled, I dried my hands and picked up my phone. The smart home app opened to its usual dashboard, lights, thermostat, speaker controls. I tapped into voice history. There it was. Multiple audio entries under Thomas's profile. Time-stamped. Labeled draft. My stomach tightened. I pressed play on one from 3 days earlier. "Caroline, I know this will be hard to hear." His tone was softer in this version. Less polished. He stopped midway and muttered, "No, that sounds defensive." Then he cleared his throat and tried again. This wasn't a spontaneous decision. This was rehearsal. I scrolled further. Another draft. "Once the foundation vote is finalized, it will be easier to explain the transition." The foundation. The Whitaker Literacy Foundation had been my project after I retired from the school district. My legacy. Our community work. Why would the foundation need to be finalized before he explained anything? I replayed the line about assets being structured. Structured how? I thought of everything we owned together. The house in Raleigh. The lake house 2 hours away. Retirement accounts. Investment portfolios. The foundation funds. I had trusted him with most of the financial logistics because that had always been his territory. Commercial real estate. Negotiations. Numbers. Now the word structured didn't sound like efficiency. It sounded like financial manipulation. I backed out of the audio log and opened our joint banking app. The first transfer I saw wasn't large. A routine-looking movement labeled Foundation Allocation Adjustment. Except it wasn't routine. There had been another one 2 weeks earlier. And another 2 weeks before that? 14 days apart. Precise. My chest felt cold. I lay in bed later that night beside him, his breathing steady and even in the dark. I stared at the ceiling, replaying his laugh from the recording. She won't see this coming. He had been wrong about one thing. I had seen it, and I wasn't going to say a word yet. The first transfer was small enough to look harmless. I lay in the dark beside Thomas. The glow from my phone dimmed to its lowest setting, and scrolled through the transaction history of our joint account. Foundation Allocation Adjustment. The description sounded responsible, almost charitable, except it wasn't a one-time adjustment. There was another transfer 14 days earlier, and another before that. The amounts were nearly identical. The dates perfectly spaced. Not random. Not emotional. Structured. I zoomed out to the last 3 months. The pattern repeated with quiet discipline, like a metronome ticking toward something I hadn't been invited to hear. Thomas shifted in his sleep and rolled onto his side. I locked my phone instantly, my heart pounding, then waited until his breathing deepened again before unlocking it. If this was preparation for divorce, it wasn't impulsive. It was financial choreography. The next morning, he left before 8, dressed in a navy suit, briefcase in hand. "Site meeting," he said, kissing my cheek. "I might be late." I smiled and told him to drive safely. As soon as his car turned out of the driveway, I walked straight to my office and logged into the Whitaker Literacy Foundation portal. The dashboard opened with its familiar blue banner and mission statement, words I had written myself when I retired from the school district. Empowering communities through literacy access. My name was still listed as founder. But under governance, something had changed. Board authority structure. Executive majority control. I stared at the line until the words sharpened. Executive majority control assigned. Thomas Whitaker. My fingers went cold. I opened the amendment document. It had been filed 3 weeks earlier. At the bottom of the page, beneath Thomas's electronic signature, was mine. Except I hadn't signed it. The digital signature matched the format used for routine approvals. The same stylized script version of my name I had authorized years ago for convenience. Only I had never approved this. I scrolled further down. Witness. Megan Whitaker. My stomach dropped. Megan would never knowingly hurt me. She trusted her father with paperwork the way I had. If he told her something was routine, she would sign without suspicion. But that meant he had already involved our daughter in whatever transition he was engineering. I pulled up the IRS nonprofit filing system and searched for recent modifications. There it was, an amendment request submitted under Thomas's credentials, adjusting voting ratios and redefining board quorum thresholds. He hadn't just prepared a speech about leaving. He had prepared to leave with control. I leaned back in my chair and tried to steady my breathing. The foundation wasn't just paperwork. It was my post-retirement identity, my legacy, my name in the community. Years ago, when we filed the nonprofit forms together, he had squeezed my hand and said, "This will always be yours." The memory flickered through me and then burned out. I needed facts, not nostalgia. By noon, I had gathered bank statements, amendment copies, and the timestamps from the smart speaker drafts. I placed them neatly into a folder and drove across town to meet Evelyn Grant. Evelyn had been recommended to me years ago by a donor who ran a regional accounting firm. I had never needed her services before. Now I did. She greeted me in a quiet cafe near North Hills, her gray hair pulled back tightly, her eyes sharp. "I need discretion," I said before I even sat down. "You'll have it," she replied. I slid the folder across the table. She reviewed the bank statements first, scanning the patterned transfers. "These aren't irregular in size," she said calmly. "They're irregular in rhythm." That's what I thought. She typed something into her tablet, cross-referencing public business registrations. "Lakeview Strategic Holdings," she murmured. I froze. "What is that?" "It's an LLC registered 6 weeks ago," she said. Mailing address matches your husband's brokerage office. My pulse thudded. Check the lake house, I said. She searched the county property database. The lake house no longer appeared under our joint title. Ownership: Lakeview Strategic Holdings, LLC. Transfer date: 6 weeks earlier. The same week, the first rehearsal draft appeared in the smart speaker log. He told me that week we were updating insurance classifications, I said quietly. Evelyn looked up at me, her expression unreadable. This wasn't insurance, she said. This was restructuring. My hands tightened around the edge of the table. Who witnessed the LLC filing? I asked. She scrolled. Megan Whitaker, she said. For a moment, the noise of the cafe faded into nothing. He had used our daughter as administrative cover. She's listed as non-equity administrative witness, Evelyn added. Likely didn't understand the implications. I nodded slowly. He had already shaped the narrative. He had already moved the pieces. Has he consulted counsel? Evelyn asked. I don't know, I said, but I had a feeling. When I got home that afternoon, I opened my email and searched for one phrase. Reeves and Cole family law. Deleted calendar invites surfaced from my trash folder. Shared entries that had once appeared on our household calendar. Quietly removed? 3 months ago. He hadn't just been preparing to leave me. He had been preparing to leave me powerless. And now I knew exactly how long he'd been planning it. I called Megan the next morning and forced my voice to sound normal. Are you free for lunch this week? I asked. Sure, she said easily. Everything okay? Of course, I replied. I just haven't seen you in a bit. I didn't ask about the foundation. Not yet. We met 2 days later at a cafe near her office downtown. She walked in smiling, hugging me tightly, completely unaware that her name had been sitting at the bottom of a document that could have shifted my entire future. You look tired, she said, studying my face. I haven't been sleeping well, I answered honestly. We ordered salads and iced tea. I waited until the server left before I spoke again. Your dad mentioned you helped him sign some paperwork recently, I said carefully. Something about restructuring. She nodded without hesitation. Oh, that. Yeah. It was just routine tax protection stuff. He said it was standard for the foundation and the lake property. My chest tightened. But I kept my expression neutral. Did you read it? I asked. She shrugged slightly. Not line by line. He explained it. Said you didn't want to deal with the administrative side anymore. I felt something cold settle behind my ribs. I didn't want to deal with it. I repeated gently. That's what he said, she replied. He said you were ready to slow down. That you both agreed he'd handle more of the financial structuring. Financial structuring. The same language he used in his rehearsal. I watched her face. There was no deceit there. Only trust. He didn't mention divorce, I asked, keeping my tone light. She hesitated. Not exactly, she said. He said you two were redefining things. That it was mutual. That you both wanted a simpler setup. Mutual. The word echoed in my mind. I see, I said. She reached across the table and touched my hand. Mom, if something's wrong, you can tell me. I smiled softly. I know. But I wasn't ready to tell her everything. 10 years ago, when the foundation awarded its first literacy scholarship, Megan had stood beside me at the ceremony, proud and radiant. Thomas had put his arm around my shoulders and told the room. This was all Caroline's vision. I had believed him. Back in the present. I looked at my daughter and realized he had been repositioning that vision for months. Do you remember signing anything about voting rights? I asked. She frowned slightly. Voting rights. Board control. Executive authority. No, she said quickly. He said it was just liability insulation. To protect you. Protect me. From what? Did he explain the lake house transfer? I pressed gently. Her eyes widened. Transfer. I nodded once. Mom, I thought that was just paperwork to move it under an LLC for tax purposes, she said. He said you knew. There it was. The narrative had already been planted. I leaned back in my chair and took a slow breath. I didn't know, I said quietly. Her face shifted from confusion to alarm. What's going on? I'm still gathering facts. I answered carefully. I just needed to understand what you were told. She stared at me for a long moment. Dad wouldn't, she began, then stopped. Wouldn't what? Wouldn't manipulate. Wouldn't conceal. Wouldn't prepare a divorce speech and laugh about it. I need you to do something for me, I said softly. If he asks you to sign anything else, read it. Or send it to me first. She nodded slowly. Of course. We finished lunch in strained silence. That afternoon, I drove to meet Daniel Reeves, the attorney whose name I had found in the deleted calendar entries. His office was understated and quiet. He reviewed the foundation amendments and LLC filings with a calm efficiency that steadied me. He consulted with another firm 3 months ago. Daniel said after checking court records, "There's no filing yet, but he's been preparing 3 months." That meant the rehearsal drafts weren't the beginning. They were mid-process. He's already adjusted board control. Daniel continued, "If the amendment is fully ratified, reversing it becomes complicated. Is it finalized?" I asked. "Not yet," he said. "One signature remains. Thomas's." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "You have leverage right now, but timing matters." Timing. Everything about this had been about timing. When I returned home that evening, the house felt quieter than usual. Thomas was in his study again. Door closed. Voice low on a call. I checked the foundation portal one more time. Board amendment status. Pending final signature. Only one name left to execute. He was waiting for the right moment to complete the shift. And I was no longer the only one in the dark. He hadn't just been planning a separation. He had been planning to tell the story first. Now I understood what I was really fighting for. Not just assets. Not just the lake house. Control of the truth. I waited until after midnight before opening the app again. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint tick of the hallway clock. Thomas was asleep upstairs. I could hear the steady rhythm of his breathing through the half-open bedroom door. I sat alone in the living room. The smart speaker dark and still on the sideboard, and scrolled further back in the voice history. There were more files than I'd noticed before. Draft 1. Draft 2. Final. I pressed play on the oldest. His voice sounded less polished. More deliberate. "Caroline, I know this will come as a shock," he began, then paused. "No, that sounds weak." A chair scraped faintly in the background. Papers shuffled. "Caroline, we both know this marriage has run its course. The separation will be voluntary." "Clean? Voluntary?" My throat tightened. "If she resists," he continued in a lower tone, "I'll pivot. But once the foundation vote closes, there won't be much to contest." I froze. Foundation vote. So that was the real deadline. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Once everything is structured, she'll see this is for the best." Structured. That word again. I stopped the recording and stared at the ceiling. This wasn't just a divorce. It was a positioning strategy. I opened draft 2. This version was smoother. "You've said yourself you're ready to slow down." He practiced, "You don't want the administrative burden anymore." The same line Megan had repeated at lunch. He hadn't just been planning assets. He had been planting language. 2 years earlier, at a neighborhood fundraiser, he had casually told a couple we knew, "Caroline's thinking about stepping back from the board soon." I had corrected him in the car afterward. I never said that. I'd told him. He had laughed lightly. "You implied it." Don't overthink. At the time, I let it go. Now I understood. It wasn't casual. It was groundwork. Back in the present. I pressed play on the final draft. His tone was confident. Almost cheerful. "Everything is already structured," he said smoothly. "Your retirement will be secure enough. You won't need to challenge the restructuring. Secure enough." As if my future were an allowance. I paused the audio and pulled up the retirement account summary Daniel had sent me earlier that day. Portions of our retirement portfolio were indirectly linked to foundation-managed endowment accounts. If he altered governance before disclosure, he could influence distributions. He wasn't just preparing to leave. He was calculating leverage. My phone buzzed softly. A notification from the foundation portal. Board amendment status. Signature pending. Deadline. 48 hours. The clock was ticking. The next morning, I called Daniel. I need to delay the amendment, I said without preamble. You can file a notice of review, he replied. But once he signs, it becomes more complex. He hasn't signed yet, I said. But he will soon? Then act before he expects it, Daniel advised. Before he expects it. That afternoon, I walked into the kitchen while Thomas was pouring himself coffee. I was thinking, I said lightly, we should have dinner this weekend. Both girls. And maybe Margaret from the foundation board? We haven't all been together in months. He looked surprised for a fraction of a second, then smiled. That's a good idea, he said. Might be the right time. The right time for what? To clear the air, he added smoothly. Clear the air? I nodded as if I agreed. Later that evening, another email notification appeared. Board amendment fully executed. He had signed. I felt the shift like a door closing quietly somewhere in the house. I opened the voice log one last time and replayed the final section. By the time she realizes, he said with a soft laugh, it'll already be done. I stared at the dark speaker on the sideboard. He thought the transition was complete. He had no idea I had been listening long enough to understand the entire sequence. And he had no idea that dinner this weekend was not going to unfold the way he had rehearsed. The candles were already lit when Thomas walked into the dining room. The table looked exactly as it had the night the speaker glitched, linen pressed smooth, silver polished, wine breathing in crystal glasses. Megan sat to my left, her sister across from her. Margaret Ellis from the foundation board adjusted her napkin with quiet elegance. Thomas smiled at everyone like a man hosting a celebration. To transitions, he said lightly as he lifted his glass. And new seasons. I held his gaze over the rim of mine and said nothing. Dinner moved forward with careful small talk. Megan mentioned work. Margaret spoke about an upcoming literacy drive. Thomas nodded in all the right places, his voice warm, steady. Then he set his fork down. There's something I've been meaning to discuss, he began, folding his hands together. His tone was measured, rehearsed. Caroline and I have been reflecting on the next chapter of our lives. I felt Megan tense beside me. We've grown in different directions, he continued. This isn't about conflict. It's about clarity. We've decided to simplify things, restructure responsibilities. Restructure. He glanced at Margaret. Caroline's been wanting to step back from the administrative burden of the foundation for a while now. Margaret frowned slightly. That's news to me. Thomas gave a polite smile. It's been a gradual decision. I placed my napkin beside my plate. Before you continue, I said calmly, I'd like clarification on something. All eyes shifted to me. I reached for the folder I had placed beside my chair and slid a stack of papers across the table. Specifically, I said, the emergency board amendment filed 3 weeks ago. Margaret picked up the document immediately, scanning it. Her expression changed. I never voted on this, she said sharply. Thomas's smile thinned. It was procedural. A timing issue. Executive majority control. Margaret said, That's not procedural. Megan looked back and forth between us. Dad. Thomas leaned back in his chair. Caroline and I discussed this. No, I said evenly. We didn't. Silence fell heavy over the table. I turned slightly toward Thomas. Perhaps you can explain Lakeview Strategic Holdings. His jaw tightened. That's standard liability structuring, he replied. Any competent advisor would recommend it. For the lake house? Megan asked, her voice unsteady. Thomas didn't answer her directly. I kept my tone steady. The lake house was transferred into that LLC 6 weeks ago, 2 days after your first recorded rehearsal. Margaret looked up sharply. Rehearsal. Thomas's eyes snapped to mine. You invaded my privacy, he said quietly. I listened to what our smart speaker played during dinner. I replied, the device glitched. It synced your drafts. Megan's face went pale. What drafts? She whispered. Thomas stood abruptly. This is inappropriate. I picked up my phone and placed it in the center of the table. You handled this privately, I said softly. Yes. You did? I pressed play. His voice filled the dining room. Once the foundation vote is finalized, it will be easier to explain the transition. The sound of his own soft laugh followed. She won't see this coming. Megan pushed her chair back slightly as if the words had struck her. I stopped the recording before it reached the end. I'm not interested in humiliating you, I said, looking directly at Thomas. I'm interested in accuracy. Margaret closed the amendment document firmly. This board will review this immediately. Thomas's composure began to crack. You're overreacting, he said to me, his voice tight. We agreed on simplification. You agreed with yourself, I replied. Megan looked at him. Confusion giving way to something harder. Were you going to tell us after everything was moved? It was going to be clean, he insisted. Dignified. For who? I asked quietly. No one answered. I've retained legal counsel, I continued calmly. Any further restructuring of marital assets will be reviewed. The word marital seemed to echo in the room. Thomas stared at me, disbelief flickering across his face. He hadn't expected resistance. He certainly hadn't expected preparation. Margaret rose from her seat. We'll convene an emergency board session tomorrow. She gathered her purse, her expression firm. The girls stood slowly, unsettled, unsure which version of reality they were now standing in. After the door closed behind Margaret and the silence thickened, Thomas stepped closer to me in the hallway. You should have let me handle this, he said under his breath. I did, I answered evenly. For 3 months? His voice dropped lower. If you think you're the only one with leverage. Caroline, you're mistaken. I met his gaze without blinking. For the first time since the speaker glitched, I saw something different in his eyes. Not confidence. Calculation turning into threat. He closed the study door behind us with more force than necessary. The house was quiet again, the echoes of dinner still lingering in the air. But the warmth was gone. The daughters had left. Margaret had driven home with a folder of copied amendments under her arm. The illusion had cracked. Thomas stood across from me, jaw tight. You should have let me handle that privately, he said. I did, I replied calmly. For 3 months. His eyes narrowed. Playing recordings at the table. That was unnecessary. I didn't play all of it, I said. I showed restraint. He let out a sharp breath. You have no idea what you're doing. I know exactly what I'm doing. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. You don't want this to turn into litigation. Caroline, once lawyers dig into everything, things get messy. Reputations get questioned. There it was. The threat wrapped in civility. What reputation are you referring to? I asked. He held my gaze. That audit issue from 10 years ago. Remember, not everyone interpreted it as clean as you did. My pulse flickered. But I didn't let it reach my face. 10 years earlier, a donor had questioned the timing of a scholarship disbursement. I had initiated a voluntary internal audit immediately. The review cleared us. There had been no wrongdoing. But ambiguity was a weapon if you framed it carefully. You kept emails, he continued softly. Conversations that could be misinterpreted. You mean documentation of me insisting on transparency? I asked. You mean documentation that could raise doubt, he countered. For a moment, I saw exactly what he was attempting. If I escalated, he would escalate harder. Not with truth, with insinuation. I've already hired a forensic accountant, I said evenly. His expression shifted. She's reviewing every transfer linked to the foundation and the LLC. I continued. Including Lakeview Strategic Holdings. He didn't speak. She's also mapping the timeline against your recorded drafts. I added. You accessed my private recordings, he said sharply. They were synced to a shared device. I replied, That's not my mistake. Silence stretched between us. The next morning, Evelyn called before 9. I found something, she said. I stepped into the sunroom and closed the door behind me. Funds from the foundation operating account were transferred into Lakeview Strategic Holdings, she explained. From there, partial investment was made into a startup called Benton Educational Consulting. Who owns it? I asked. Claire Benton. Registered 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks. The same window as the Lake House transfer. It overlaps with your foundation's mission. Evelyn continued. Educational services. So he redirected philanthropic funds into a private venture. I asked quietly. It appears that way. The amounts are structured carefully. Not large enough individually to raise immediate red flags. Structured. Of course. I ended the call and dialed Daniel immediately. If foundation funds were redirected, he said, that introduces exposure beyond divorce. Potential civil liability. Can we freeze further transfers? I asked. Yes. If you file for legal separation now, it triggers mandatory financial disclosure and can support an emergency review of marital assets. File first. Not react. Lead. That evening, Thomas behaved as if nothing had shifted. He poured wine. He asked about groceries. He moved through the kitchen with controlled calm. You're overcomplicating this, he said casually. I don't think I am, I replied. He studied me carefully. You always liked control. No, I said. I liked clarity. I went to my office and opened the documents Daniel had prepared. Petition for legal separation. Request for temporary injunction on asset restructuring. Emergency review of marital estate. My hand hovered for a moment over the signature line. 32 years of marriage reduced to a set of filings. Then I signed. The next morning, Daniel secured the earliest available filing slot, 9:17. Before noon, Thomas would be formally notified. That night, I lay in bed again beside him. But I wasn't listening to his breathing this time. I was listening to the space between us. He had rehearsed leaving me. I was about to file something he hadn't prepared for. And when the paperwork arrived at his office, it would not be a draft. It would be real. The courthouse hallway smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper. I stood beside Daniel at the clerk's counter while fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The folder in my hands felt heavier than it should have, thick with bank statements, amendment filings, and transcripts I had printed from the smart speaker logs. The clerk stamped the petition. 9:17 in the morning. The sound of the stamp landing on paper was sharper than I expected. Final. It's filed, Daniel said quietly. By noon, Thomas would be served at his brokerage office. There would be no rehearsal for that moment. When I returned home, I didn't sit down. I walked straight through the house, past the dining room, past the silent speaker on the sideboard, and into my office. At 11:43, Daniel texted. He's been served. I imagined the envelope placed in his hands. The polite but firm explanation. The recognition in his eyes as he understood I had moved first. Filing for legal separation triggered immediate protections. Asset transfers were automatically subject to review. Mandatory financial disclosure would follow. He could no longer quietly transition anything. 2 days later, we sat across from each other in a mediation room at the county courthouse. Neutral walls, long table, bottled water placed neatly in front of each chair. Thomas looked composed, his suit immaculate, his expression controlled. His attorney spoke first. Mr. Whitaker's restructuring actions were standard business optimization, she said smoothly. There was no malicious intent. Daniel slid a document across the table. Timeline, he said. Asset transfers. LLC formation. Foundation amendment filing. Audio draft timestamps. The sequence told its own story. Thomas's attorney shifted slightly. private rehearsal is not evidence of wrongdoing. No, Daniel agreed. But it establishes intent prior to disclosure. The mediator looked at Thomas. Why were significant marital assets transferred without written acknowledgement from your spouse? He asked. Thomas clasped his hands together. It was liability structuring. Efficient. Caroline knew I handled those matters. I met his gaze calmly. I handled literacy programs, I said. Not hidden asset transfers. The room stilled. Daniel introduced the documentation showing foundation funds moving into Lakeview Strategic Holdings, and from there into Benton Educational Consulting. Thomas's jaw tightened. That investment is legitimate, his attorney said quickly. Separate from the marriage. Funded through a joint foundation account. Daniel replied. The mediator made a note. Temporary suspension of the foundation amendment was ordered pending audit review. The Lake House transfer was flagged for spousal consent examination. The word suspension felt like oxygen returning to a sealed room. Outside the mediation room, Megan was waiting. She stepped toward me cautiously. I didn't know, she said immediately. About the timing. About the vote. He told me you wanted less responsibility. I know, I said softly. Her eyes filled. Not with tears, but with realization. He said it was mutual, she whispered. I nodded. He needed you to believe that, I said. She looked back toward the closed mediation door. I should have read it. You trusted your father, I answered. That's not a crime. Thomas exited a few minutes later with his attorney. He didn't look at me directly. For the first time in months, he wasn't leading the sequence. He was reacting to it. Daniel walked beside me toward the parking lot. There's more, he said quietly. The Benton investment is under review. If foundation funds were misallocated, there could be broader exposure. I nodded slowly. Karma didn't always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it arrived in paperwork. When I drove home that afternoon, the house felt unfamiliar in its quiet. Not tense. Just altered. I stood in the dining room for a long moment, staring at the sideboard where the speaker had first betrayed his rehearsal. He had crafted the perfect speech. He had structured the perfect exit. But paperwork doesn't rehearse. It records. And now everything was being recorded. The house felt different once he moved out. Not emptier. Clearer. The first night Thomas slept in his corporate rental, I walked through each room slowly, turning off lights that had been left on for years, opening windows that had stayed shut out of habit. The silence no longer felt heavy. It felt honest. The smart speaker still sat on the dining room sideboard. I unplugged it, not because I feared it, because I no longer needed it. Weeks passed in measured steps. Court orders arrived in envelopes that looked deceptively ordinary. The Lake House transfer was reversed, pending full marital review. The foundation amendment was suspended until an independent audit could be completed. Lakeview Strategic Holdings was flagged for investigation. Claire Benton's startup funding was traced directly to redirected foundation transfers. Under scrutiny, portions were reimbursed quietly. Thomas's strategy had relied on momentum. Paperwork slowed momentum. Mandatory financial disclosure forced transparency. Retirement accounts were protected. Asset movement required joint acknowledgement. The phrase marital estate appeared again and again in legal filings. For the first time since the glitch, I slept through the night. Margaret met me at the foundation office 2 weeks later. I've never seen anything like this, she said, closing the door behind her. Not in all my years on nonprofit boards. I have, I replied quietly. I just didn't recognize it soon enough. We convened an emergency board session. The amendment Thomas had executed was nullified pending investigation. I proposed new bylaws, clear oversight clauses, mandatory dual signatures for structural changes, external auditing requirements. No more quiet restructuring. One addition surprised even me. I proposed expanding our mission to include financial literacy workshops for women over 50, retirement protection, asset awareness, legal preparedness. Margaret smiled slowly. That's personal. Yes, I said. It is. The vote passed unanimously. Reclaiming the foundation did not feel like revenge. It felt like restoration. Megan and her sister came over one Sunday afternoon. We sat at the same dining table where everything had fractured weeks earlier. I keep replaying that dinner in my head. Megan admitted. You didn't yell. You didn't cry. I wanted to, I said honestly. So why didn't you? Because panic would have given him control. Because outrage would have confirmed the narrative he had rehearsed. Because preparation is power. I needed to understand first. I said instead. She nodded slowly. He really thought you wouldn't investigate. I almost smiled. That was his first mistake. The final meeting with Thomas took place at Daniel's office. No raised voices. No dramatic accusations. Just paperwork. He looked older somehow. Less certain. I was trying to make things efficient, he said once. Almost defensively. Efficiency without honesty is betrayal, I replied calmly. He didn't argue. In the end, the separation agreement reflected what should have been transparent from the start. Shared assets divided fairly. Retirement secured. Foundation control restored solely to the board without unilateral authority. He had rehearsed a clean exit. What he hadn't rehearsed was resistance. Weeks later, we hosted our annual literacy event at the community center. I stood at the podium, looking out at familiar faces, teachers, donors, volunteers, women who had built lives quietly and fiercely over decades. I didn't mention divorce. I didn't mention betrayal. I spoke about transparency. I spoke about protecting what we build. I spoke about not surrendering control of our financial futures simply because someone else sounds confident holding the paperwork. The applause felt different that night. Not louder. Stronger. When I returned home, I stood once more in the dining room. The table was bare. The house was steady. The night the speaker glitched. I thought technology had exposed my marriage. It hadn't. Deception had. The glitch only removed the curtain. What changed everything wasn't the recording. It was the choice I made after hearing it. I could have confronted him immediately. Screamed. Accused. Collapsed under the weight of marriage betrayal. Instead, I listened. I gathered facts. I filed first. If you had overheard the truth before the betrayal happened, before the divorce papers were served, before the assets disappeared, what would you have done? Would you have confronted him in anger? Or would you have prepared quietly? I'm sharing this because too many women assume calm means weakness. It doesn't. Sometimes calm is strategy. Sometimes silence is leverage. If this story reminded you that preparation is power, stay with this channel. There are more stories here about women who refused to be outmaneuvered, who faced financial manipulation and family drama and chose clarity over chaos. Tell me in the comments what you would have done in my place. Have you ever uncovered a hidden truth just in time? And if you believe it's never too late to reclaim control of your own life, subscribe and stay with us. He rehearsed his exit. I rewrote the ending.